When Ethan Cole walked into that courtroom, everyone thought he was crazy. He wasn't wearing a suit. No lawyer walked beside him. His old denim jacket was faded at the seams, and the dust of the Colorado hills still clung to his boots. The courtroom was packed, developers in sharp gray suits on one side, HOA members on the other, their eyes full of smug confidence. They whispered and snickered when Ethan took his seat at the plaintiff's table, alone. To them, he wasn't a threat. He was just some small-town mechanic who didn't understand how business worked. The HOA's lead attorney, Ronald Pierce, leaned over to his client, Victoria Harris, the icy president of the Ridgefield HOA, and muttered, "This won't take long." She smiled, crossing her arms like she was watching a show she'd already seen the ending of. The judge entered, banging the gavel once. "Court is now in session." Ethan didn't flinch. He'd waited almost 2 years for this day. Pierce began with his usual arrogance. "Your Honor, the plaintiff claims ownership of land that has, for over a decade, been legally incorporated into the Ridgefield Homeowners Association. 96 homes, hundreds of families, millions of dollars invested. This man has no valid claim." A few HOA members chuckled. One developer smirked, tapping his pen impatiently. The judge looked down at Ethan. "Mr. Cole, do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Ethan stood slowly. His voice was calm, steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he placed an old, weathered briefcase on the table. It looked completely out of place among all the sleek laptops and polished folders around him. He unlatched it. The sound echoed in the silent courtroom. From inside, he pulled out a single, yellowed document, creased at the folds, the edges soft from age. He held it up so everyone could see. It was a deed. A deed older than anyone in that room had ever seen, stamped and signed in bold ink that had barely faded after 6 decades. "This," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the silence, "is the original deed to the 47 acres your clients built their homes on." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The HOA's lawyer tried to laugh it off. "A piece of paper doesn't prove ownership, Mr. Cole." Ethan nodded slowly. "You're right. But this isn't just a piece of paper." He stepped forward, handing the document to the court clerk. The judge examined it closely, frowning, then reading the text out loud. "Property of Thomas Cole, Ridgefield County, Colorado. Passed by inheritance to Ethan Cole upon death. Recorded March 12, 1961. The room went dead silent. One woman in the back gasped, her hand covering her mouth. The HOA president, Victoria Harris, sat frozen, color draining from her face as she realized what that meant. That piece of paper didn't just claim the land. It proved that every one of the 96 luxury homes sitting on it, worth millions, had been built on someone else's property. And that's how Ethan Cole, an ordinary man with an old family secret, walked into court alone and brought an entire multimillion-dollar neighborhood crashing down. But to understand how he got here, you have to go back to the beginning. Ethan Cole wasn't the kind of man who liked attention. He'd spent most of his life fixing things that other people broke: tractors, small engines, crop dusting planes. 10 years as a mechanic in the open fields of Colorado had taught him 2 things: patience and silence. When his grandfather passed away, the world didn't stop. There was no dramatic reading of a will, no gathering of distant relatives. Just a short letter from the family attorney and a small, rusty lockbox delivered to his apartment in Denver. Inside, he found 2 old keys, a folded property map, and a note written in his grandfather's careful, shaky handwriting. "To Ethan, the land is yours now. Take care of it the way your father never could." Ethan smiled at that. His father had been the wandering type, always chasing work, never settling down. But his grandfather, Thomas Cole, had stayed rooted like the pines he planted decades ago. So when the lawyer mentioned a small piece of property near Ridgefield, Ethan pictured maybe 5-10 acres tops, a patch of forest and a quiet stream where he could escape city noise. He didn't expect anything more. He tossed the old keys and the lockbox into the passenger seat of his truck and started the 5-hour drive from Denver. The highway wound through open plains, golden grass swaying in the summer wind. The mountains grew larger in the distance, their peaks catching the afternoon sun. By the time he reached Ridgefield, the air had turned cooler, sharper, carrying the scent of pine and dust. He turned down a narrow gravel road, following the faded directions scribbled on the map. The tires crunched on loose rock as the trees thickened around him. Eventually, he saw the old coal property sign, half buried in weeds and rusted nearly through. "Guess this is it," he muttered, cutting the engine. He stepped out into silence, the kind of silence that feels alive. Birds chirped from somewhere high in the trees, and a creek murmured nearby. He could almost imagine his grandfather here, walking the land, tending to it like a friend. But as he walked further down the trail, something changed. The silence was broken by a low rumble, deep, steady, mechanical. Then came the metallic clang of hammers, the whine of saws, the unmistakable grind of heavy equipment. Ethan frowned. That shouldn't have been there. He kept walking, pushing through the tree line, and froze. Right in front of him, the forest opened up into chaos. Bulldozers crawled across the valley floor. Concrete foundations stretched in long, neat rows. Cranes swung beams into place. Cement trucks lined up like ants along the dirt road. It looked like an entire town was being born out of the ground. For a moment, Ethan thought he'd made a wrong turn. But when he climbed a nearby hill to get a better view, his stomach dropped. There it was, a massive billboard planted in the middle of the site. "Welcome to the Bluffs at Ridgefield, A. Taylor Creek Development." Below it, a smiling family posed in front of a sparkling blue lake that didn't even exist yet. Ethan blinked, stunned. There were dozens of new houses already built, their white siding glinting under the sun. Families were touring model homes. Realtors were shaking hands with buyers. Kids were running down the gravel streets, laughing. It wasn't a construction site anymore. It was a community. And it was sitting right on top of what was supposed to be his land. Ethan's pulse quickened. He looked down at the folded map in his hand, his grandfather's handwriting marking boundaries and creeks. Then back up at the sign, the houses, the hills. Everything matched. Every tree line, every slope, every stream. It was the same land. He parked near the temporary office, a white trailer with tinted windows and a shiny logo, and walked in. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and fresh paint. A man in a crisp polo shirt looked up from behind a laptop. His name tag read, "Craig Walters, Project Manager." "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice clipped and professional. "Yeah," Ethan said slowly, holding up his map. "This here's my land. My grandfather's property. What's going on out there?" Craig stared for a moment, then chuckled. "Sir, this is private property owned by the Ridgefield Homeowners Association. You must be mistaken." "Mistaken?" Ethan's brows furrowed. "My grandfather's owned this land since 1958. I've got the papers." Craig shrugged, still smiling, but his tone hardened. "You'll have to take that up with the county. We've got permits. We've got buyers. And we've got deadlines. So unless you have something official, I suggest you move along before we call security." Ethan felt a burn in his chest. Not anger, something colder. He turned without a word and walked out. The wind had picked up, carrying the sound of hammers and drills through the valley. The sun was dipping behind the hills, painting the new rooftops gold. He sat in his truck that night, headlights off, watching the glow of the construction lights flicker against the dark mountains. He couldn't sleep. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Before dawn, he drove back to his grandfather's old house. Dust coated everything, but the memories were still alive in the creak of the floors and the smell of old pine. He climbed the narrow attic stairs, flashlight in hand, and started digging through boxes. Hours passed. Old photo albums. Tool sets. Faded newspaper clippings. Nothing. And then, tucked inside a cracked leather ledger from 1961, he found it. A folded piece of thick paper, stamped, signed, and notarized. Land deed, owner, Thomas Cole. Land area, 47 acres. Transfer upon death to Ethan Cole. And in the margin, a note in familiar handwriting. If they ever come for this land, show them this paper. It's worth more than gold. Ethan sat there in the dim attic light, the deed trembling in his hands. Outside, the morning sun was rising over the same hills his grandfather once owned. Now he knew the truth. And he knew this fight was just beginning. Ethan Cole showed up at the Ridgefield County Records office the next morning before the doors even opened. The building was old, built in the 1940s with sun-bleached bricks and a creaky wooden door that squealed like it hadn't been oiled since the Reagan era. He waited by the counter, clutching his grandfather's deed like it was a lifeline. When the clerk, a young woman named Tara, finally called him up, he unfolded the document carefully on the desk. "I need to check ownership on this property," he said. She glanced at the paper, then at her computer screen. Her expression shifted from polite to puzzled. This parcel number doesn't show up in our active database." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked. "Well, according to this," she turned the monitor toward him, "this entire area is part of the Ridgefield HOA. It was merged into the association back in 2009. "By who?" Ethan demanded. She clicked through a few screens, frowning. "Taylor Creek Development. They filed the boundary merger 16 years ago, claiming the land had been unoccupied and abandoned for over a decade." Ethan stared at her. "Abandoned? My grandfather lived there until he died last year." Tara sighed, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, sir. It's not uncommon for these things to happen if ownership records weren't updated properly. You'll need to contact an attorney." "An attorney? Right." Ethan didn't have that kind of money. He left the office with a deed in one hand and his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan became a man obsessed. By day, he worked odd mechanic jobs around town to cover gas and food. By night, he sat hunched over boxes of documents in the county archives, piecing together what had happened. And the more he found, the angrier he got. The developer, Taylor Creek, had bribed a local surveyor years ago to redraw the boundary maps. They'd submitted fake maintenance logs claiming they'd been maintaining the property for years, which made it look like an abandoned lot under HOA management. The county clerk at the time, now conveniently retired to Florida, had rubber-stamped the paperwork without checking a single record. It was theft, plain and simple. And everyone involved had gotten away with it. Ethan gathered copies of old maps, tax receipts, and even a black-and-white photograph from 1973 showing his grandfather standing beside the same creek the HOA now called Ridgefield Lake. But every time he brought the evidence to someone in authority, they brushed him off. The county zoning officer told him, "That's civil court stuff, son. Beyond our jurisdiction." The sheriff said, "As long as they got permits, there's nothing criminal here." The local newspaper editor shrugged. "Without an active lawsuit, it's not a story." Ethan realized something. No one cared. Not the county, not the HOA, not even the people living on his land. So he went to the source, the Ridgefield HOA office itself. The HOA's headquarters sat on top of a hill overlooking the brand-new neighborhood. The building looked like a mountain lodge, stone pillars, wood trim, a giant chandelier in the lobby. Ethan walked in wearing his dusty work jacket, earning instant side eyes from the receptionist. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone syrupy but cold. "Yeah. I need to speak to your president, Victoria Harris." The receptionist hesitated, then forced a smile. "Do you have an appointment?" "I don't need one," he said flatly. She started to object, but before she could, a tall woman in a gray suit stepped out of a glass-walled office. Perfectly styled hair. Diamond bracelet. A confident smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Victoria Harris," she said. "And you must be the gentleman causing all the confusion about property lines." Ethan crossed his arms. "Not confusion. Theft." Her smile tightened. "Mr. Cole, I assure you everything we've done here is completely legal. Taylor Creek purchased this land over 15 years ago." "With whose permission?" Ethan shot back. "Because this deed," he held up the yellow document, "says it's been in my family since 1961. Victoria chuckled softly. "Oh, come on. That's not a valid deed anymore. If it were, it'd be recorded with the county. Which it's not." "Because your developer hid it," Ethan snapped. "They filed fake surveys." "Fake is a strong word," she said, her tone turning sharp. "And I'd be careful throwing around accusations like that. You're trespassing, Mr. Cole. If you set foot on Ridgefield property again, we'll have to call the authorities." Ethan stared at her for a long moment. Her voice was calm, But her eyes betrayed something, nervousness. She knew she was lying. He smiled faintly. You built all this thinking nobody would ever check. But my grandfather kept records of everything. Every acre. Every creek. Every corner marker. Victoria leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Let me give you some advice. Walk away. Before this gets ugly. Ethan didn't reply. He turned and walked out, her words echoing in his head all the way back down the hill. That night, he sat in his truck again, watching the lights flicker across what used to be his family's land. He could see silhouettes of families eating dinner through their brand-new windows, their laughter floating out into the cool night air. They didn't know the ground beneath them wasn't theirs. He clenched the steering wheel. He'd been fighting the wrong battle. There was no point trying to stop them. The HOA had money, lawyers, and connections. If he pushed too soon, they'd bury him in paperwork and spin it until he looked like the crazy one. So he made a different plan. He'd let them finish. Every house. Every sale. Every permit filed in his land's name. He'd let them tie their own noose. And when the last roof was nailed, and the last family moved in, he'd pull the rope. Over the next year, construction roared ahead. The bluffs at Ridgefield became the pride of Colorado's luxury living scene. Magazines featured it. Realtors bragged about it. Victoria Harris posed for photos in front of a stone gate that read, Private HOA Community, Residents Only. Ethan stayed quiet. But in the background, he was building his case. Photographs, witness statements, copies of records, notarized proof of inheritance. Every piece of paper, every timestamp. He didn't just want to prove ownership. He wanted to expose them. Because they hadn't just stolen land. They'd stolen his family's legacy. And when the time came, he would make sure every person in that courtroom knew it. The Ridgefield County Courthouse was packed that morning. The gallery buzzed with low conversation, reporters clutching notepads, residents whispering, lawyers exchanging smug smiles. Everyone had heard the rumors. A local mechanic suing the Ridgefield HOA for millions, claiming he owned the land their luxury homes stood on. Most people thought it was a publicity stunt. Ethan Cole sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, his suit slightly wrinkled, his hair combed but still stubbornly disheveled. Across from him sat the HOA's legal army, 5 attorneys in tailored suits, armed with thick folders, confidence, and disdain. At the center of it all, like a queen on her throne, sat Victoria Harris, calm and smiling. She didn't even glance at Ethan. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a no-nonsense voice, rapped his gavel. Cole versus Ridgefield Homeowners Association is now in session. The HOA's lead attorney, a sharp man named Richard Gable, rose first. Your Honor, this case is a waste of the court's time. Mr. Cole's claim is based on an outdated, invalid document. The land in question was lawfully transferred to Taylor Creek Development in 2009, and all subsequent HOA property is fully registered under that deed. He smirked as he sat down. The judge nodded. Mr. Cole, do you have representation? Ethan stood. No, Your Honor. I'll be representing myself. A ripple of laughter went through the courtroom. One of the HOA lawyers muttered under his breath, Good luck, cowboy. Ethan ignored them. He reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of yellowed papers, carefully bound in a file. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady but quiet, this isn't just about land. It's about a lie that's lasted 16 years. A lie that stole my family's home. Victoria shifted in her seat for the first time. Ethan continued. My grandfather, Samuel Cole, purchased 47 acres of land outside Ridgefield in 1961. He built a small cabin and lived there until his death in 2023. He paid property taxes every year. I have the receipts. He handed copies to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. Gable scoffed. Your Honor, those are personal records, not legal proof of ownership. Ethan nodded. True. That's why I also have this. He opened the file and pulled out a folded, yellowed sheet, the original deed. The paper was brittle, the ink faded but legible. Gasps rippled through the gallery. This is the 1961 deed, Ethan said. Signed, notarized, and registered with the state under Parcel 42-716B. It lists my grandfather, Samuel Cole, as the owner of the land currently developed as Ridgefield Estates. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. You have the registration number? Yes, sir. And the corresponding map. Ethan laid out a copy of the 1962 county map, one that clearly marked the parcel as Cole property. The courtroom fell silent. Victoria's lawyers flipped frantically through their documents. One of them whispered something to Gable, who immediately stood. Objection! That document is over 60 years old. There's no proof it wasn't superseded or voided by later transactions. Ethan didn't flinch. I expected you'd say that. He reached back into his case and pulled out another document, crisp, freshly notarized. This is a certified statement from the Colorado State Archives. It verifies that the Parcel 42-716B deed was never transferred, never sold, and never condemned by eminent domain. It remained privately owned by the Cole family until present day. You could hear a pin drop. Even the judge seemed stunned. Are you saying the county records were falsified? Yes, Your Honor, Ethan said firmly. In 2009, Taylor Creek Development submitted fraudulent boundary maps, claiming the property was abandoned. They bribed a surveyor and used fake maintenance records to support the claim. The county clerk at the time signed off without verification. The judge's eyebrows rose. Do you have evidence of that claim? Ethan nodded slowly. I do. He handed the clerk a folder filled with photocopies, emails between the developer and the surveyor, payment receipts, and a sworn affidavit from Tara, the clerk who helped him uncover everything. This is evidence that Ridgefield HOA's land rests entirely on private property that was never theirs to begin with. The judge began leafing through the papers, his expression hardening. The HOA table erupted into hushed arguments. Victoria's face had drained of color. Richard Gable stood again, trying to regain control. Your Honor, even if, and I stress if, these documents are legitimate, the statute of limitations. Ethan interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension. Ownership doesn't expire, Mr. Gable. You can't steal land and wait it out. The gallery murmured. Gable opened his mouth again, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. Enough. I'll review this evidence personally. He turned to Ethan. Mr. Cole, if your documents are verified, this could have serious implications for the HOA, the developers, and the county office involved. Ethan nodded. That's all I want, Your Honor. The truth. The judge called for a recess. As people filed out, Victoria approached Ethan. Her polished confidence was gone. You think this will stick, she hissed. Even if you win, we'll appeal. You'll never see a dime. Ethan smiled faintly. I don't want your money. I just want you to tear down every brick you built on my land. She froze. You wouldn't. Oh, I would, Ethan said softly. And when the bulldozers come, I'll be sitting right here, watching. Victoria glared at him, but for once, she had no comeback. When the court reconvened that afternoon, the judge spoke with measured authority. Based on the evidence presented and verified by the state archives, the court finds that the property known as Ridgefield Estates was never lawfully transferred. Ownership remains with the estate of Samuel Cole, represented by Ethan Cole. A collective gasp filled the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. The judge continued, all existing structures, sales, and HOA operations on this property are therefore invalid and subject to immediate legal review. Victoria covered her face with her hands. Ethan sat quietly, his jaw trembling, as the gavel came down one final time. Judgment in favor of the plaintiff, Ethan Cole. When he stepped outside, the sun hit his face like a blessing. He looked down at the deed in his hand, the same one his grandfather had once tucked away for safekeeping. 16 years of lies. One document. Justice. And as the cameras flashed and the reporters shouted questions, Ethan smiled for the first time in months. He'd done it. He'd brought an empire down with a single piece of paper. The ruling sent shockwaves through Ridgefield County. Within 24 hours, local news channels, bloggers, and national outlets were all running the same headline. Man wins back 47 acres after HOA builds 96 homes on his land. Drone footage showed the sprawling neighborhood, modern houses, freshly paved roads, manicured lawns, now sitting on land that legally belonged to one man, Ethan Cole. The HOA office locked its doors. The developers vanished overnight. The Ridgefield president, Victoria Harris, resigned within a week. And those once smug homeowners who'd laughed at Ethan during the early court hearings? They were suddenly terrified. Their dream homes were technically built on stolen ground. Ethan didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He simply drove back to his grandfather's old cabin, parked his truck under the same pine tree where he used to fish as a boy, and sat there for a long time, listening to the creek that still whispered through the valley. He thought of his grandfather, the old man who'd always said, "Land is the only thing you can't make more of." Now Ethan understood what that meant. Weeks later, Ethan's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted interviews, developers wanted settlements, and lawyers wanted him to sign deals that would make him a millionaire overnight. But Ethan didn't want fame or fortune. He wanted peace. So he did something no one expected. He refused every offer. Instead, he called a small-town real estate attorney named Deborah Wells, the same woman who'd helped him verify the old deed. Together, they drew up a plan that would make history. Ethan decided to keep 20 acres, the heart of the valley where his grandfather's cabin stood, and donate the remaining 27 acres to the state as protected forest land. "Let it stay the way it was meant to be," he said. "Quiet, wild, and free." The developers tried to appeal, of course. They filed motions, claimed good faith investment, and begged the court to let them repurchase the land. But the judge's ruling was final. Every home built without consent would face legal removal or renegotiation directly with Ethan Cole. One by one, the homeowners received letters informing them that their properties sat on unlawfully developed land. Most were furious, until Ethan made an announcement. He called a town meeting at the local community center. The place was packed, filled with anxious faces. When Ethan stepped onto the small stage, the crowd went silent. He looked around and said calmly, "I know most of you didn't know. You bought your homes fair and square. This wasn't your fault." People exchanged nervous glances. "I could take it all back," Ethan continued. "I could force you to move. But that's not what my grandfather would have wanted." He held up the original deed, the yellowed paper that had changed everything. "My grandfather always said, land should be shared with good people who respect it. So here's what I'll do. Anyone who lives here can stay, on one condition. The HOA is dissolved. No more fines. No more greed. No more bullying people off their land. From now on, we do things the honest way." There was a long pause. Then, one by one, people began to clap. A few even cried. By the end of that meeting, the homeowners had signed an agreement officially dissolving the Ridgefield HOA. Victoria Harris never showed up again. The county launched an investigation into Taylor Creek development for fraud and corruption. 2 executives were arrested. The fake surveyor lost his license. And the crooked clerk who'd signed off the original paperwork retired under suspicious circumstances. Justice, finally, had a name: Ethan Cole. Months later, spring rolled over the Colorado hills. Wildflowers bloomed where the last bulldozers had once stood. The air smelled of pine and fresh rain. Ethan rebuilt the old fence around the cabin and added a small sign at the gate. Cole Valley, private land, preserved forever. He didn't want riches. He didn't want revenge anymore. He just wanted peace, and maybe, somewhere, his grandfather was smiling down, proud that Ethan had done what he couldn't. Sometimes, when the sun dipped low over the mountains, Ethan would sit on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the light fade across the valley. He'd look out at the land, his land, and whisper quietly, "We did it, Grandpa." And in that quiet moment, when the wind rustled the pines and the creek murmured through the rocks, he felt something deeper than victory. He felt home. They built 96 homes on one man's land, but they forgot one thing: truth doesn't fade. It just waits. Subscribe for more real-life revenge stories. Fire new uploads every week. True power, real justice.